Welcome to LexTalks Legal Topics Simplified.
Yes.
Today, we're going to be doing a deep dive into
Mm.
the Air Prevention and Control of Pollution Act of 1981.
All right.
Quite a mouthful,
Yeah.
but super important,
Very important.
especially for all you students out there.
Absolutely.
I think this is some essential knowledge that you're going to want to have.
Definitely. Definitely.
So to start us off, can you kind of give us a quick overview of this act? What is it all about?
Sure. Well, this act, you can think of it as the rule book when it comes to air pollution in India. So it kind of lays down the law on, what counts as air pollution, who's responsible for stopping it, that sort of thing. It's all about setting standards for clean air, figuring out, where the pollution is coming from, and then giving power to certain bodies to, make sure those standards are actually met.
So it's not just about, factories spewing out smoke.
Not at all. Not at all. The act is actually pretty broad in its scope. So, we're talking vehicle emissions, burning stuff that's not even really fuel, all sorts of things.
So when we say air pollution, what exactly are we talking about?
Well, the act actually gets pretty specific about this. So it defines air pollution as any solid, liquid, or gas that's present in the atmosphere in such concentration that it could be harmful or, has the potential to be harmful.
Hmm.
So that means it could harm human beings, animals, plants, property, or even just the environment itself.
So it's not just about, what we can immediately see and smell.
Yeah.
It's about the long-term impact, too.
Exactly, exactly. It's about the potential for harm as well. So, even something that might seem relatively harmless, if it's in a high enough concentration, that can actually be considered pollution under this act.
Wow. Makes you think twice about, what we're putting out there, right?
Definitely. And it's fascinating because, even back in 1981, when this act was passed, they were already concerned about things like vehicle emissions.
Oh, wow.
So it really shows, kind of a foresight considering all the issues we face today.
Yeah. They were kind of ahead of their time in a way.
In a way, yeah.
So the act keeps mentioning these, all-powerful boards. Who are they? What do they do?
Okay, so we've got two key players here. First up, you have the Central Pollution Control Board, or CPCB for short.
Okay.
You can think of them as the national headquarters when it comes to air pollution. So they set the overall standards for air quality and emissions across all of India.
So they're kind of like the masterminds of this whole operation.
Yeah, you could say that. And then at the state level, we have the State Pollution Control Boards,
Okay.
SPCBs for short.
Okay.
And they're the ones on the ground actually making sure that those national standards set by the CPCB are being met.
So a two-tiered system there.
Right.
But what does that enforcement actually look like? Do they actually have any power?
Oh, they definitely have some power, yeah. The act gives them some pretty serious authority, so they can issue notices to polluters, demand that, improvements are made, and they can even shut down entire industries
Wow.
if they're not playing by the rules. In some cases, they can even control things like the electricity and water supply to really force compliance.
Wow, they don't mess around.
No, they don't mess around. But beyond just kind of that stick approach, they also play a very important role in prevention and control.
Okay.
So they advise the government on air pollution matters. They help to plan and implement programs to control pollution. And they also play a big role in educating the public. So it's not just about punishing polluters, but also, working towards improving air quality.
Okay, so it's a much more balanced approach, combining that, strict enforcement with proactive measures as well.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And a crucial part of that is setting what we call emission standards.
Okay.
So these are specific measurable limits on how much of different pollutants can actually be released from different sources.
Hmm.
And these standards, the goal is to keep air quality within safe limits. They're based on, scientific research and analysis and that sort of thing.
So it's not like they're just pulling these numbers out of thin air.
Not at all. Not at all. The CPCB has actually established specific limits for all sorts of pollutants, taking into account both, short-term and long-term exposure to those pollutants.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting, too, is that they have different standards depending on, what kind of area we're talking about.
Right.
So industrial zones, residential areas, rural regions, even ecologically sensitive zones all have their own kind of tailored limits.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, which makes sense considering how diverse India is and how many different sources of pollution there are.
Right, exactly. It's all about, tailoring it to the specific situation.
I guess this brings up the question, though. If this act is so comprehensive and these boards have all this power, why is air pollution still such a big problem in India?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's something that we're going to be, diving into as we continue our deep dive today.
Okay, so let's get into it. What are some of those challenges and shortcomings of the AIR Act? Where does it maybe fall short in addressing, the air pollution crisis that we're facing today?
Yeah. Okay, so one of the biggest criticisms of the AIR Act, and, rightfully so, is that it's incredibly outdated.
Outdated in what way?
Well, it was last amended all the way back in 1987.
Oh, wow.
Think about it.
That was the Stone Age.
The world, especially India, has changed so much since then.
Yeah.
And that means, the types of pollution sources that we're dealing with today are just far more diverse and far more complex than what they probably even imagined back then.
For example.
Well, think about construction dust.
Okay.
It's everywhere, right?
Right.
Especially with, the amount of urbanization that's happening in India.
Yeah.
It's a massive contributor to air pollution.
Hmm.
But the actor, drafted in a different era, just doesn't really adequately address it.
So it's like trying to fight a modern war with, outdated weapons.
Exactly. And it's not just about these new sources, but technology itself has also completely changed. We now have all these, sophisticated systems that can monitor emissions in real time, provide us with tons of data. But the Act still relies on things like manual inspections and taking samples a lot.
So we have all this information, but we don't have the, legal framework to really utilize it effectively.
Right. And that's incredibly frustrating, especially when you consider how urgent the issue of air pollution is.
Yeah.
And then there's also the whole issue of enforcement. The Act outlines, penalties for those who break the rules. But a lot of people argue that they're just not strong enough to be a real deterrent.
What do you mean by that?
So for a lot of offenses, the maximum penalty is just 3 months in jail and a fine. And honestly, for some of these big companies, the fine is pocket change,
Yeah.
It's nothing. And that's assuming that the penalties are even enforced consistently, which is, a whole other debate.
So is the act essentially toothless then?
It's not completely toothless, but it's definitely hindered by this weak enforcement and these outdated provisions we talked about. And to make things even more complicated, some people argue that the AIR Act is basically redundant.
Redundant.
Because they claim that the Environmental Protection Act, which was passed in 1986, already covers much of the same ground.
So we have two laws that are potentially, covering the same issues. That seems confusing.
Yeah. It does raise some concerns about, the coherence and the clarity of India's environmental regulations. But it's important to acknowledge that despite all of this, the Act has had some positive impact as well.
Okay, so what are some of those wins?
Well, for one, it's definitely been instrumental in raising awareness about air pollution as a serious issue. It's set up, that framework for air quality management that we talked about with the pollution control boards, and it's given those boards a platform to take action. And there have also been some very important legal cases that have, highlighted the significance of the AIR Act.
Tell me about those cases.
One of the most famous ones is what's known as the MC Mehta case.
Okay.
And it actually involved two separate petitions.
Okay.
One focused on vehicular pollution in Delhi, and the other was dealing with a toxic gas leak from a factory. And these cases were really groundbreaking because they directly linked the right to clean air with the fundamental right to life.
Wow.
Which is enshrined in Article 21 of the Indian Constitution.
That's huge.
Yeah.
So even though the act itself might have some flaws, the courts have kind of stepped in and strengthened its impact through these judgments.
Exactly. It just goes to show, how public interest litigation and judicial activism can play a huge role in pushing for environmental protection, even when legislation, might be falling short. It's a good reminder that citizens do have a voice. And can hold those in power accountable. Now, speaking of, shortcomings, remember we talked about how the act is a bit outdated? Well, a 2014 committee actually recommended repealing it altogether.
Really?
Yeah.
That's pretty drastic.
It is a bit drastic, yeah.
What was the reasoning there?
So this was the TSR Subramanian Committee,
Okay.
and they were tasked with reviewing India's environmental laws. And they just found so many overlaps, outdated provisions, weak enforcement mechanisms. And they just came to the conclusion that a complete overhaul was needed and that scrapping the AIR Act in favor of something, more comprehensive and more up to date was the best way to go.
So is the AIR Act on its way out then?
Well, it's hard to say for sure.
Okay.
While their recommendations did spark a lot of debate, there hasn't really been any concrete action taken to actually repeal the act.
Okay.
So it's still in effect, but its future is definitely uncertain. This leaves us with a very important question. What needs to change to really ensure clean air for everyone in India?
Right. Because we've uncovered all the intricacies of this act,
Yeah.
explored its strength, its weaknesses, but at the end of the day, we really want to see those improvements.
Absolutely. And, achieving that requires kind of a multi-pronged approach. We need stronger regulations,
Hmm.
more effective enforcement. We need to really utilize those technological advancements that we talked about.
Hmm.
Public awareness needs to be raised, and we really need commitment from all stakeholders, to prioritize clean air as a fundamental right.
Hmm.
It's a complex puzzle.
It's a challenge for sure, but I think, one that we need to tackle head on
For sure.
for the sake of, our health, our environment, and the future.
Hmm.
And I feel like we've just kind of, scratched the surface here.
Yeah.
There's so much more to explore.
Definitely. And in the next part of our deep dive, we'll be looking at some of the specifics of the Act's enforcement mechanisms.
Okay, sounds good. I'm ready to dive back in.
All right, let's do it.
Yeah.
In the last part, we were talking about how those pollution control boards have the power to just walk into a factory and demand information.
Yeah, that definitely sounds pretty intense.
It is. It's a pretty powerful tool. You can think of it kind of like, a detective investigating a crime scene. So armed with their authority under the Air Act, officials from the State Pollution Control Board can actually enter any industrial facility that they suspect, might be violating those emission standards we discussed.
So do they just show up unannounced?
Not quite, no. Typically, they would issue a notice to the factory owner letting them know that an inspection is coming.
Okay, so it's not a complete surprise,
Yep.
but what happens during the inspection itself? What are they looking for?
Well, they have pretty broad authority.
Okay.
So they can examine the entire facility.
Mhm.
They can check the pollution control equipment, review records, take samples of the air and emissions, all sorts of things. It's about getting a full picture of, the factory's environmental practices.
And what if the factory owner, tries to hide something or refuses entry?
Well, that's where the Act enforcement mechanisms come in. Obstructing an inspection is a serious offense.
Okay.
It can lead to some pretty hefty penalties. The boards have the power to hold polluters accountable, and this power of entry and inspection is a really big part of that.
So there are consequences for trying to, pull the wool over the eyes of the pollution police.
Absolutely.
But this all hinges on having enough people to do these inspections, right? I mean, India must have thousands of factories.
You're absolutely right. Staffing and resources are essential. The pollution control boards have a huge responsibility,
Hmm.
but unfortunately, they don't always have, you know, the manpower or the funding to do everything as effectively as they would like.
It's kind of like giving someone this massive puzzle to solve, but only giving them half the pieces.
Exactly, exactly. And that can lead to inconsistent enforcement, which of course, undermines the whole purpose of the act.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond manpower, there's also the question of whether these inspections are even the most efficient approach. You can't possibly inspect every single factory all the time, right?
Right. And that's where I was thinking those real-time emission monitoring systems would come in, right? The ones that are constantly tracking pollution levels.
Exactly. Integrating those systems into the Act's enforcement would be huge.
Mm.
It would give the boards this continuous stream of data, and it could really reduce the need for all those, frequent manual inspections.
Right.
And it would allow them to really focus their limited resources on the polluters that pose the biggest risk.
It's like having a security camera that alerts you when something's wrong,
Yes.
instead of having a security guard constantly patrolling.
A perfect analogy. And it's
Yeah.
not just about efficiency, but real-time monitoring could also help identify those pollution spikes as they're happening. And that allows for much quicker intervention. It could even prevent, more serious environmental damage. It shifts the focus from reacting to problems to proactively preventing them.
So staying one step ahead, basically.
Exactly. And this brings us to a key takeaway here.
Ugh.
The AIR Act, while it might have some flaws, it represents a real shift towards a more proactive way of managing our environment. It's about recognizing how important clean air is, establishing these clear standards, and then creating mechanisms to make sure that those standards are met.
But as we've seen, those mechanisms aren't always perfect, and there's definitely room for improvement.
Oh, absolutely. And that's an important point for students who are studying this.
Mhm.
The AIR Act is not static. It's a living piece of legislation, and it will continue to evolve.
Mhm.
It'll be interpreted in different ways, especially given how fast the world is changing.
It really is a case study, isn't it, in just how complex, environmental law and governance can be.
Absolutely, yeah. And it highlights how important it is to have that ongoing dialogue, the research, the innovation,
Hmm.
to really find the most effective ways to protect the environment.
So we've talked a lot about the Air Act and its enforcement,
Yeah.
but how does it fit into the bigger picture of all of India's environmental laws? You mentioned the Environmental Protection Act. How do these two pieces of legislation interact?
That's a great question. It's important to understand that the AIR Act doesn't exist in isolation.
Okay.
It's actually part of a much big or broader network of environmental laws in India.
Hmm.
And the Environmental Protection Act, we often call it the EPA, sits right at the top of that hierarchy.
Okay.
So it's kind of like the umbrella legislation,
Right.
providing this really comprehensive framework for environmental protection across the entire country.
So the Air Act just focuses specifically on air pollution within that broader framework.
Exactly. The EPA gives the government these really sweeping powers to regulate all forms of pollution, set standards, and take action against polluters.
Hmm.
The AIR Act is more like, a specific tool within that toolkit
Okay.
designed to tackle the unique challenges of air pollution.
So they work together, they're not competing.
That's the idea, yes.
Okay.
The EPA sets the broad principles, the mandates, the big picture stuff.
Hmm.
And then the AIR Act provides those detailed mechanisms for actually controlling air pollution. They should complement each other, create a more robust system. But as you mentioned earlier, some argue that the AIR Act is redundant because the EPA covers so much already.
Right.
And this really gets to the heart of one of the big challenges in environmental law in India. There's a lot of overlap between the different laws,
Hmm.
and that can be confusing. Sometimes it's not clear, which law takes precedence.
So it's not always a perfect harmonious relationship between the two.
It can get complicated, yeah, especially given how many laws and regulations and agencies are involved in environmental governance in India.
So it's not just about having, strong laws on paper, but making sure that they all work together effectively.
Exactly. It's a constant process of review and reform. Remember the TSR Subramanian Committee?
Right.
They were tasked with looking into all of these issues
Hmm.
and trying to find ways to, streamline things, strengthen the whole framework.
So the Air Act, despite maybe its shortcomings, is still an important piece of the puzzle when it comes to protecting the environment.
Absolutely. And understanding how it fits in with everything else is crucial to understanding its significance. Now, speaking of the bigger picture, let's talk about the impact of these environmental laws on businesses and industries. Regulations often come with costs, right?
Right, because if you have to comply with these regulations, you might have to invest in new technologies, maybe change your processes, potentially even face fines if you mess up.
That's all true. And those costs can be significant, especially for smaller businesses that may not have the resources that a large corporation has.
So there's this kind of tension, isn't there, between economic growth and protecting the environment?
There can be, yeah. But it doesn't always have to be a zero-sum game.
Mm.
More and more businesses are realizing that sustainability
Mm.
and environmental responsibility, it's not just about doing the right thing. It can actually be good for business.
In what way?
Consumers are becoming more aware,
Mm-hmm.
and they're more likely to support companies that share their values.
Mm.
There's a growing market for eco-friendly options.
So it's not just about avoiding penalties, but attracting those customers, building a good reputation.
Exactly. And there are other benefits, too. Investing in energy efficiency, cleaner production methods. These things can actually save companies money in the long run.
So it's not always about sacrificing profits for the planet. There can be situations where everybody wins.
Absolutely. And that's something I think it's important to emphasize. These regulations are often seen as a burden, but they can actually drive innovation, create opportunities for businesses that are willing to, embrace those sustainable practices.
Necessity is the mother of invention.
Right.
Exactly. Sometimes those constraints force us to think outside the box and come up with better solutions. And this is a key takeaway, I think, from our deep dive on the AIR Act. It's not just about rules and penalties, it's about shifting our mindset, fostering this sense of responsibility for the environment, and figuring out how we can balance economic growth with protecting the planet.
And that really does require everyone working together, right?
Absolutely. It's not just on the government or the businesses, but individuals, policymakers, even students learning about this. Everyone has a role to play.
I completely agree. It's a collective effort, and the AIR Act is just one piece of a very large puzzle.
This has been a fantastic conversation. We've covered so much,
We have.
from the technical aspects to the broader picture and how it impacts everyone.
Definitely. And there's one more very important aspect of the AIR Act that we haven't talked about yet,
Yeah.
and that's the role of citizen participation. That's what we're going to be diving into in the final part of our deep dive.
I can't wait. Okay, so we're back for the last part of our deep dive into the AIR Act. We've talked about the law itself, the enforcement, the challenges, even some of the, successes, but one piece seems to be missing. What about us? What role do everyday citizens play in all of this?
You're absolutely right. We can have the most amazing laws in the world, but if people aren't involved, if they don't care, it won't make a difference.
Hmm.
Citizen participation is really the key to making environmental protection actually work.
Okay, I get that. But it's easy to feel powerless. What can I, as one person, do about air pollution? It's not like I can go and shut down a factory.
You're right, you can't be vigilante, but there are so many ways to make a difference. First and foremost, knowledge is power.
Hmm.
The more you understand about air quality, the better you can take action.
So where do I even begin?
Well, the CPCB and the state boards, they actually publish a lot of data on pollution levels.
Hmm.
And they even have mobile apps
Oh,
that will
yeah.
give you real-time information. Start by understanding what's happening where you live.
Okay, so once I'm aware of the problem, what's next?
That's when you can start advocating for change. Contact your elected officials, write letters to newspapers, speak up at those public hearings, make sure your voice is heard, and let them know that you care about clean air.
So it's about holding our leaders accountable.
Exactly. And don't forget about collective action.
Mhm.
There are so many environmental groups working on these issues. Join them, support them, even volunteer your time. Even small things like participating in tree planting drives or speaking up for better public transportation can make a difference.
So it's about taking action, not just waiting for someone else to fix things.
Absolutely. And the AIR Act has provisions for people to report pollution violations. If you see something that's not right, don't just ignore it.
So we can be like the eyes and ears on the ground, helping the pollution control boards do their job.
Exactly. The more involved we are, the better the act can work. It's a shared responsibility.
Listening to all this, it makes me think that the AIR Act isn't just a law. It's kind of like a reflection of our values as a society. It means we've decided, as a country, that clean air is worth fighting for.
I love that. And you're so right. It shows that we see this as a basic right, something essential for everyone's health and well-being.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. We've covered the details of the Act, talked about how it affects everyone, and now learned about how important it is for us to be involved. It really feels like everything's coming together.
It's been fantastic. The main takeaway, I think, is that the AIR Act, with all its good points and its not so good points, is ultimately a tool. And it's our job to use it wisely as informed citizens to create a cleaner, healthier India for everyone, both now and in the future.
That's a really powerful thought. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the AIR Act of 1981. We hope you've learned a lot and feel ready to get involved.
Absolutely. Remember, knowledge is power, and by working together, we can really make a difference.
Thanks for tuning in. Subscribe to LexTalks for more legal insights.